In the heart of the Iranian plateau, between the 2nd and 1st millennium BC, a system of thought emerged that, according to any known historical model, should not have existed in that form and at that time. Not for its artistic or architectural complexity, but for something much more important, the level of abstraction of its knowledge. Here we find a complete system that speaks of impersonal cosmic laws, individual responsibility, conscious choice between truth and falsehood, concepts that historically emerge much later. The question then is not whether ancient Iran was advanced. The question is why it possessed a kind of knowledge that does not fit within its historical context. And this is where the problem arises, because this civilization does not claim to have discovered these ideas. It claims to have received them.
Teach me, O Ahura, what has been established since the beginning, so that I may understand it and speak of it truthfully.
In this video, we will talk about a specific documented historical anomaly that challenges the way we tell the story of the origin of human knowledge. But before we get to the heart of this investigation, as always, we invite you to subscribe to the channel to support our work and not miss our upcoming insights. When we talk about ancient Iran, most people think of the Persian Empire, a precise, well-documented historical entity that officially began in the 6th century BC with the rise of Cyrus the Great. A vast, organized empire capable of administering enormous territories with laws, roads, tax systems, and a surprisingly modern political vision. On this, history is clear. But the Persian Empire did not arise from nothing. It did not suddenly appear in an empty region, nor did it build its cultural identity from scratch. On the contrary, it relies on a heritage of ideas, values, and worldviews that are much older, which the empire inherits and reorganizes. This is where the problem arises, because when we try to reconstruct what existed before the Persian Empire in the area of the Iranian plateau, we do not find what we would expect. The picture is typical of the ancient world: local cults, nature-related practices, tribal deities, a fragmented and concrete religiosity. And this is exactly where the problem arises. Because when the Persian Empire takes shape, it does not bring with it a developing way of thinking. It brings a worldview that is already coherent, already abstract, already self-aware, an idea of cosmic order, of individual responsibility, of choosing between truth and falsehood, which does not originate at that moment, but is taken as a foundation, as something that already existed. And it is at this point that a name appears, one that is still difficult to place precisely even today: Zoroaster. Not as the founder of the Persian Empire, nor as a figure directly connected to its power, but as a reference to an earlier, more ancient tradition that the empire recognizes as authoritative. A tradition that did not arise at the time of imperial expansion, but that predates the empire itself. What we observe appears as a clear gap between what existed before and what suddenly becomes the foundation of one of the greatest civilizations in history. And at this point, if we want to understand the origin of that gap, we cannot start from the ideas, but we must start from the figure through whom that knowledge is traced back. The chronological placement of Zoroaster is uncertain, but the range is clear. The most cautious hypotheses place him between the 6th and 12th centuries BC, while others, based on linguistic analysis of the oldest texts attributed to him, push him even further back. In any case, we are talking about a figure who predates or is contemporary with the birth of the Persian Empire, not a product of the imperial age. This is the first established point. The second is even more relevant. In the oldest texts of the Zoroastrian tradition, Zoroaster does not appear as a founder of a cult. He does not establish temples. He does not set up complex rituals. He does not create a religious hierarchy. In the Gathas, the text considered the oldest core of the tradition, we do not find stories of miracles or supernatural interventions meant to demonstrate a charismatic authority. Zoroaster conveys knowledge. He speaks of order, of choice, of responsibility, of truth and falsehood as objective categories. He does not say that he invented them or that he discovered them. He says implicitly that he received them. His role is not that of an author, but of an intermediary. And this is the most destabilizing objective element. And this is where the fundamental question arises. What kind of civilization produces a central figure who does not create, does not lay foundations, does not put on a spectacle, but transmits? A civilization that, instead of telling the story of the birth of a religion, seems to tell the story of the preservation of knowledge.
Listen with your own ears and understand with your mind, each for yourself, before the great fulfillment comes. Before you, two paths are laid, the path of truth and the path of falsehood. Choose consciously, for each person is responsible for their own decision.
This idea that knowledge is not created but received and preserved is not confined to texts. In ancient Iran, this concept was made visible, carved in stone, transformed into symbolic language. In the most important monuments of ancient Persia, such as the bas-reliefs of Behistun or the walls of Persepolis, above the figure of the king, there is never an empty space. The Faravahar systematically appears, a man emerging from a winged disc with a ring that does not indicate possession, but a bond. It's not a decoration, it's a visual statement. Power and knowledge do not belong to man by his own right, but come from an order that precedes him and surpasses him. This is how the idea of received knowledge becomes the pillar, not only conceptually but also visibly, of the entire Iranian civilization. Everything we have seen so far, the absence of a primitive phase, a figure who transmits knowledge, forms the basis of a central concept in the most ancient Iranian tradition. Asha is not a god, not a deity with a personality, a will, or a character. It is not even a moral norm in the common sense of the term. Asha is described as the very order of the universe, an impersonal principle that regulates the functioning of the cosmos, which exists independently of man, the gods, and human societies.
I ask you this, tell me truthfully, O Ahura, who has set the path of the sun and the stars, who makes the moon wax and wane, who has supported the earth and held up the sky so it would not fall, who has set the waters and the plants, who has placed the breath of life in the wind and in the clouds? I ask you this, O wise one, who created Asha, the order that governs the world?
In archaic religions, the order of the world almost always depends on the gods, on their balance, their conflicts, their whims. The laws change because the deities change, and myths explain why the world is unstable, unpredictable, subject to the intervention of the sacred. In the Iranian case, however, order precedes everything. Even the divine entities are subordinate to this law. Man, in the face of Asha, has no creative power. He cannot modify it, he cannot bend it, he cannot bypass it. He can only do three things: understand it, respect it, or violate it. And this is where something profoundly unusual for the time happens. Because Asha doesn't work like an archaic religious principle, it works like a physical law, and that's a problem. And this is where the anomaly arises. An idea like that, in that period, shouldn't already be so clear, because it requires a huge mental leap. Imagining a universe governed by impersonal laws, independent from man and myth. And it's right here that we reach a new breaking point, because if we stop for a moment to observe this concept, without overlaying modern interpretations, one question becomes inevitable. How does a culture from the Bronze Age come up with such an abstract idea, so non-mythological, so similar to a conception of the cosmos, governed by objective laws and not by the will of the gods? It's surprising how the Iranian model ultimately stops resembling a religion and starts behaving like a technical description of reality. If Asha represents an impersonal order that regulates the cosmos, then an inevitable consequence is that not even the gods are free to act outside this law. In the oldest texts, this idea isn't just implied, it's written in black and white.
According to Asha, actions are established, consequences are determined, and every being receives its own destiny.
So, in the oldest Zoroastrian texts, we don't find what characterizes most religions of the Bronze Age. The destiny of man seems to depend exclusively on how he behaves in relation to this order. If the action is consistent, it produces one result. If it isn't, it produces another. It's a simple relationship of cause and effect, not of divine favor or punishment. And at this point, one question becomes inevitable. Who was this figure who had this knowledge, and why did he feel the need to teach it to mankind? Before trying to answer this question, it's necessary to take a step back and ask ourselves if the Iranian case really represents an isolated exception. If that were the case, we could file it away as an extraordinary but limited cultural anomaly. The problem is, it's not. If we broaden our perspective, we actually discover that the idea of knowledge not created by man, but received, runs through many of the oldest civilizations on the planet. In the Indo-Aryan world, the Vedic texts, which are older than the Iranian tradition and can be dated at least to the 2nd millennium BC, define knowledge with a specific term, shruti, that which has been heard, not something that is invented, but something that is listened to and transmitted even earlier. In Sumerian civilization, one of the oldest in documented history, laws, fundamental techniques, and even writing are not presented as human achievements. Texts. This knowledge is attributed to an external origin, embodied by figures like Enki, the one who delivers to humanity the principles necessary for civilization. And this pattern does not stop if we move outside the Near East. In pre-Columbian civilizations, figures like Quetzalcoatl are remembered not as capricious deities, but as bearers of knowledge who arrive, teach, and then disappear. The language changes, the symbolism changes, but the structure of the story remains surprisingly similar. What emerges, then, is a recurring pattern. Humanity in different places and times has often described the origin of knowledge as something that does not fully belong to it, but is instead passed down to it. And this legacy has not only left traces in texts, it has been imprinted in matter. If we look at some of the great architectural complexes of antiquity, we notice a characteristic that is hard to ignore. They don't seem to be the result of initial attempts, but of an already mature expertise in ancient Iran. At Persepolis, we find extremely precise stonework, polished surfaces, accurate joints, and a conscious management of large stone volumes. On the other side of the world in the Andes, sites like Sacsayhuaman or Ollantaytambo show the same level of control over the material. Perfectly matched polygonal blocks, complex surfaces, and a scale that leaves no room for improvisation. Peoples separated by oceans and millennia seem to master the same identical grammar of stone. And sometimes this legacy is not only evident in the techniques, but in iconographic details so specific that they seem like a signature. In Mesopotamia, the bringers of civilization, the Apkallu, are depicted with a recurring object, a small bag with a semicircular handle. The exact same object appears in the hands of sacred figures in the Mesoamerican area, and we even find it engraved on the pillars of Göbekli Tepe in Anatolia over 11,000 years ago. We're not talking about a generic symbol, we're talking about a precise, repeated, recognizable detail that crosses continents and eras without an accepted linear explanation. So what we observe is this. Many ancient civilizations not only speak of knowledge they received, but they also show in their works similarities, as if based on the same original model. If the Iranian case were isolated, we could dismiss it as an extraordinary local anomaly, but it is not. And it is at this point that we are forced to ask a question that historiography tends to avoid, not because it is irrational, but because it is difficult to handle. If knowledge in Iran as elsewhere is not described as a human discovery but as a legacy, where does this knowledge come from? The most common answer is that it is a normal evolution of myth, but what emerges from the text does not take the form of myth. It doesn't tell stories. It doesn't portray deities in action. It doesn't explain the world through narrative symbols. Instead, it describes an abstract, impersonal order, valid before man and independent of him. And this is what makes this explanation insufficient. A second answer that is often given is that all this comes from a long oral evolution, which has now been lost. This is certainly a legitimate possibility, but it is not a complete answer. Because while it does explain how knowledge could have been preserved, It doesn't explain how it appears already in such a mature form, nor why it is remembered as something received and not as something constructed. So there remains a third hypothesis, the most difficult to handle, but also the most consistent with what we have observed, that some ancient civilizations are not telling the story of the birth of knowledge, but rather the distorted memory of a contact. Not necessarily with gods, in the religious sense, not necessarily with supernatural entities, but with something that, in terms of understanding, organization, or worldview, was perceived as external and superior. From this perspective, Zoroaster would not be a founder or intermediary. Asha would not be a metaphor, but the conceptual residue of a model of reality that had already been developed. And the absence of miracles would not be a lack, but a consequence. There's no need for miracles when you're transmitting rules. And maybe those who transmitted this knowledge weren't even able to perform miracles because they weren't divine, but were simply passing on knowledge that seemed divine. Obviously, this hypothesis can't be dismissed easily either, because it explains three elements that, taken together, would otherwise remain unconnected. The sudden appearance of mature conceptual systems, the figure of transmitters who don't establish anything, and the constant memory of knowledge as an inheritance. Even accepting just this possibility would mean admitting that the origin of civilization might not coincide with the origin of knowledge, and this would push the beginning of our history much further back than we are used to thinking, perhaps simply outside of man himself. Today we have added another piece to a picture that for some time now no longer seems to add up, a clue that connects to many others we have already analyzed, and that pushes us to look at our past in a different way, not as a slow, spontaneous construction, but as a story made of transmissions, inheritances, and already mature knowledge. Knowledge that suggests an uncomfortable possibility that the beginning of our civilization does not coincide with the beginning of knowledge, and that something much older precedes everything. But now it's up to you. How do you explain this sudden and extraordinary leap in knowledge and vision of reality? Let us know in the comments, and if you enjoyed the video, subscribe to the channel, share it, and keep following us on our other social media channels, where we continue our work without the limitations of this platform.